Welcome to another episode of the Grid Buzz podcast, where we will be doing our race review on the Monaco Grand Prix. So, Monaco this year, there was a bit of a switch up in the rules, tried to make the race a little bit more exciting with the the mandatory two-stop strategy, and the move to the one-step softer compounds, once again running the same compounds as Imola with the C6, C5, C4. At Imola, it seemed like the two-stop or the softer compound seemed to add a little bit more excitement, make the GP a little bit better. That was not really the case here in Monaco. So I think this is proven that the two-stop alone is not enough to save these GPs. When you look at Imola, there was also overtakes in addition to the crazy strategy. Here, it was really just a lot of strategy and almost no overtakes throughout the GP. And that is where the problem lies with Monaco in the modern era of Formula One. There's just not enough room to overtake. The cars have gotten way too big under this hybrid era. The only thing I think that is going to save the Monaco GP is not some mandatory two-stop strategy, which in a way kind of worked because you did see at least the front runners not playing the slow game, backing the entire field up and then just making it impossible to pass. They at least were at times that you've seen at Monaco the last couple years in the midfield, notably with Lawson and Hadjar. Lawson playing the team game and really backing up the field so that Hadjar could get his pits in. Then more towards the end of the race, we saw this with Williams, with Sainz backing up the field for Albon, then Albon and Sainz switching, and then Albon backing up the field for Sainz, and then them switching again, and then the whole Russell incident and everything. But I think this is just essentially come to show that we're not going to fix this race on race strategy. I don't know what the ultimate fix is here. Do they try to set some sort of lap time delta to make sure that people aren't going 5 seconds off the pace, which was happening throughout this GP? We saw, when Behrman, I think, pitted at the beginning of the race, he was running 5 seconds quicker than the leader. Is there some sort of delta to prevent that in future races? But that gets hard to manage too, because you have people on different compounds and different age tires, and there can be a significant, lap time delta as a result of those influences. So I don't know exactly how they would implement that. I know that was discussed as a potential for this year, but the race director decided not to go with it, which I do think was the right move. We should definitely had let the two-stop strategy play out and see if that was the solution. It clearly wasn't. So maybe that lap time delta is explored next year. I mean, the real solution is we just need to make Formula One cars smaller and lighter again. Unfortunately, with the push towards this hybrid era and the electric engines and everything, the cars are only going to get heavier. And yes, the next generation of cars they touted is they got smaller. They really didn't get smaller. It was I believe the stats was they got smaller by a couple millimeters, I believe. And it got a lot of recognition because it was the first time in the last few sets of rule changes where the car didn't get bigger. So even though it got smaller by a very, very small fraction, it's the first time that the car didn't get bigger. I don't know exactly what's going to happen from a weight perspective, but I would imagine with the bigger electric engines that the cars are also going to get heavier again. It's just, we need to go back. We need to go back to the V10 era, get the cars smaller. At least the racing will be a bit better. Or, I don't know, maybe they just put everybody in shifter carts for the Monaco GP one time a year and just have them do that race in shifter carts. I have no idea. This is it's sad to see such an iconic race like Monaco, a race that since I started watching Formula One in 2007 was always kind of my dream race to go to. And hopefully I do make it out to a Monaco GP one year, but the racing itself has just been on such a big decline that I almost feel like it takes some of the magic out of that GP away, and the interest in that GP now goes to all of the things that are happening around the Monaco GP that aren't necessarily the racing itself, which is not the place you would want an iconic Grand Prix like the Monaco GP to be, where the cool things about the GP are showing up in a yacht and watching the race from a yacht, and like things that don't really have to do with the GP itself. So yeah, I do think it was a little bit more exciting. I will say that with the two stop than last year, for example. Other than the Leclerc win, that was obviously super exciting for me personally as a Leclerc fan. But overall, I do think it was still quite a letdown, and something needs to be done to save this GP for future races. With that, though, we'll go into kind of a breakdown and review of the actual events of the GP. There were some interesting events that happened at least throughout the race. Notably, really gave my hopes up with that Norris poor start and lockup on lap 1, turn 1. I was really hoping that Charles was going to be able to overtake Lando into the first corner. Lando, historically, starting on pole, has not had the best starts ever. I think this was another instance of that. A little bit slow off the line. Leclerc had a much better start than Lando, and then Lando had to go deep into the braking zone in order to try to save it. Ends up locking up pretty significantly, a double front lockup for a little while. He does hold the position though, so good on him for that. I was hoping that he maybe flat spotted his tires as a result, and that would give Leclerc some sort of advantage to maybe overtake on this extremely difficult track. But that wasn't really the case either, obviously, throughout the race. But it did give me some false hope at the beginning of the race. Unfortunately, that false hope didn't turn into anything, and Leclerc did get second. So, second step of the podium, I think, is a pretty good finish relative to where Ferrari has been lately. So I would call it a win overall, but, not as sweet as seeing him on the top step, which hopefully he returns to that for future years and Ferrari has a little bit better of a car. Then moving into another interesting lap 1 moment was Bortoleto v Antonelli. So Bortoleto actually had a pretty nice around the outside overtake, I thought. Antonelli was getting backed up a little bit by the train of cars in front. Bortoleto kind of capitalizing on that, going around the outside. But then he did make a pretty big rookie mistake of leaving the inside open a couple corners later, and Antonelli snuck up the inside, and there's just not enough room for two cars to go side by side through that corner into the tunnel, and just ends up driving the car straight into the wall. I would imagine he had to have seen, he definitely saw Antonelli there. That's the whole reason that he swung that corner so wide. But it was a severe miscalculation to think that with Antonelli so far up the inside that he was going to be able to go side by side through that corner. Just, I don't know, Bortoleto, F2 champion. Granted, he's in a Sauber, but pretty underwhelming performance so far, I would say, this year. It's hard to get a real read because he is in that kick Sauber, but I just don't think it's been great overall. And, hopefully things change in the future and he gets a better car and we're able to get a more accurate read on what his potential talent is in Formula One. But not a good performance by him. Another really big mistake. Not that it was going to cost him points or anything. He wasn't going to get points anyway, but just still, I think another big mistake that set him back. On the bright side, he was able to restart the race, obviously down and behind, but he was able to get himself back to the pits, new front wing. Nothing too big on the damaged front. But yeah, definitely a rookie error there. Then a couple laps later, we have Gasly on Tsunoda. Gasly gets a little bit caught out heading down into the chicane. I can't tell if it was just that Tsunoda braked earlier than Gasly expected. I do think that was an aspect of it. Gasly did report, not having front brakes. I did watch the replay. It did look like he maybe hit a little bit of a bump as he went under braking, and that might have unsettled the car a little bit and took some load off the front, which made it feel like it didn't have front brakes. I don't think I ever saw anything that came out that confirmed any front brake failure, but you could see from the onboard that the car didn't stop in the way that you would expect a Formula One car to stop. And then he lugs that thing all the way back to the pits. I'm actually very surprised that he got that car all the way back to the pits because it was pretty cooked, honestly. And, kind of dropping carbon fiber all over the racetrack. There was that bit of front wing on the end of the chicane, which caught Oscar Piastri out and almost gave Verstappen an opportunity to overtake during the yellow flag. But then Piastri, shut the door on that. And there was that kind of funny radio message from Verstappen of him, trying to get a penalty, most likely from the stewards, as he was complaining about Oscar shutting the door on him. But he was, pretty sneaky trying to do an overtake right after the yellow flag there anyway. So, I'm glad that kind of nothing happened there and they let that one go. But yeah, Gasly limps the car all the way back. The yellow flag's out. I know that some of the commentators, when I was watching back the broadcast, were talking about how, a VSC or a full safety car should come out. I'm actually glad that they did not. In normal circumstances, I would say, yeah, like a VSC would probably make sense there. But for a couple things, and sometimes I see incidents like this, and I wish they would yellow flag them a bit more and not go to the VSC and just leave the gap between the leader and the last car as the opportunity to jump out onto the track and kind of clean those bits up. Traditionally, they do not do that, which I understand why. In this instance, they did do that. And I'm glad that they decided to do that because there was already a VSC, a lap into the race. And it would have been a super big bummer to see another VSC or even a full safety car, which was being called for by some of the commentators, another couple laps into the race, because then it would have potentially ruined the mandatory two-stop strategy and whether we would have been able to assess if the two-stop strategy worked. So I would imagine that if a VSC and especially if a full safety car came out, that most of the field would dip probably back into the pits, at least for their first pit stop. And some of the people who pitted under the VSC might have dipped in for the second. And then we would have been left hanging at the end of the race of like, hey, could this mandatory two-stop strategy work? Could it be the savior of Monaco? And because that didn't happen, we were able to see the two-stop strategy play out in more real time under more normal conditions without safety car interventions. I think it's pretty safe to say that it did not work. So I'm glad that they held the yellow flag and we were able to, kind of come to that conclusion and not have to wait until Monaco next year and do another mandatory two-stop just to kind of find out the answer that I think we did find out this year. Then, we head into the strategy game with the two stops. So like I said, the front runners were at least kind of running at a semi-quick pace, I would say, relative to what we've seen recently. The midfield and back of the field, though, that was not the case at all. They were doing the typical Monaco strategy, especially when teams who had two drivers that were right next to each other or in close vicinity. We saw this with Lawson and Hadjar to start. Lawson was playing the ultimate team game, really backing up the field. He came over the radio at one point and even mentioned how he didn't think he could back up the field all that much more without putting him at risk for overtakes, which I do think is maybe another sign that even a lap time delta might not save the Monaco GP here. Like I said, that was talked about for this year. Maybe we explore it next year, but we have cars, multiple sets of cars actually this race. We're backing up the field, probably going 5 seconds off the possible pace, and they were still unable to be overtaken. And so I think that's probably also a sign that even a lap time delta is really not going to save this race, because they slow down at parts of the track that are very hard, if not impossible, to overtake, and then they speed up a little bit at parts of the track that are overtaking opportunities. Or, in the case of Russell Albon, maybe they were braking inconsistently or irregularly or unpredictably. And so that was causing some issues going into a typical overtaking zone because, the person behind is caught guessing when they're going to have to get on the brakes, which is not a place that you want to be in. So I'm not sure that a lap time delta would solve this either. But yeah, we did have Lawson playing the team game, backing it up for Hadjar. For a second, I thought almost that Hadjar might go back-to-back pit stops with that kind of gap. That didn't necessarily happen, but he did back it up. And then we saw a little bit later, I think an even more extreme version of this, honestly, was, the signs for Albon and the Albon for signs, and then them flopping positions again so that Albon could get back ahead of signs after Albon played the team game for signs. What an interesting situation that was, not really the racing you want to see. And the other things about it is not only is it not the racing you want to see in the mid-pack, but then it created a really interesting and weird dynamic for the front runners who were at least trying to hold a little bit faster of a pace and were running more of a normal race, not maybe a full normal race, but closer to it, because now they're caught up in a chain of 8 cars that are going super slow, not necessarily moving out of the way super quickly either. And that added an interesting dynamic. You heard some radio messages from Lando, from Charles about their frustrations about being held up in the pack. So just overall, super sloppy, super messy kind of GP. I don't know what the answer is here, but at least in the Albon Sainz kind of Mercedes situation, it did provide for some entertainment, even though it was not good racing at all. Russell kind of trying to pretend that Albon was braking super inconsistently, which maybe he was. I don't know. He probably was to a certain extent, but he definitely tried to overplay that a little bit and use that as an excuse to cut the chicane, and then thinking that he's going to get a 10-second penalty, which is ultimately better because he can probably go run the pace on all the clean air that's in front and build that gap up. However, that did not work out at all with not only the drive-through penalty, but then another drive-through penalty awarded at the end of the race, which I think added like 20 or 30 seconds onto his race time. So completely backfired. It came out after the race that before the race as well, during the drivers' meeting, they were kind of predicting that something like this might happen. And so the race director called out that anyone cutting that chicane to gain an advantage would potentially see a greater than 10-second penalty. And that's exactly what happened in the instance of Russell, which is unfortunate. I think it was clever. It was interesting, but at the end of the day, I think it was the right penalty. They can't allow that to happen because then everyone's just going to be probably bombing that chicane as an overtake and trying to use it for 10 seconds. And that's going to create a even more interesting dynamic in the race that, to be honest, could potentially be dangerous. So while the team strategy was pretty lame, honestly, and we even saw Fowles come out after the race with like a very formal team announcement on the Williams Instagram page, basically saying that he hated that he had to go race that way, but it was within their rules and they did what they needed to do to score points for Williams, and they've now gotten points in back-to-back races. And so they did everything that they could within the rules to do that, but that the teams and the drivers and the FIA and everyone should come together to review what happened and review the rules and see what can change for the future, so that just isn't even on the table. But it was on the table this year, and so he had to do what he had to do to take advantage of it. It was also pretty interesting because I heard it came out after that Vowles was texting Toto mid-race basically saying, I am sorry for doing this, but I got to do what I got to do, which is a funny dynamic, but I know that, those two go way back and are super close. So it makes sense, similar with Albon and Russell, with Russell's joke at the end of the race that Albon's going to owe him dinner for doing that. And then they posted a photo on Instagram shortly after of Albon picking up the bill for Russell at dinner. So at least it added for, a little bit of fun off-track banter and controversy. But once again, overall, not what you want to see in F1, the pinnacle of motorsport. You want to see cars going around the track as fast as possible. You don't want to see cars basically going around the track as slow as possible without going so slow that they get overtaken. That's not really what you want to see in the pinnacle of motorsport. But it is, unfortunately, how this race played out. Like I said, gave us some interesting off-track moments, which, if anything, at least we got that. And then shortly after, we had Antonelli do something similar where he cut the chicane and, overtook on Albon. I'm a little bit confused, though, on what happened with that. I watched the replay back. I can't fully tell what happened. And what I mean by that is I can't tell if Antonelli truly got caught off under braking heading into that chicane and then had to move to the outside. After watching the replays, it did actually look like that to me. When I first saw it happen, I almost thought that Mercedes was playing some games here of like, oh, Russell was struggling with this, so he had to do an evasive maneuver, cut the chicane, and decided that, he was just going to keep the position and go on. But he decided that retroactively, and that wasn't a proactive decision. And now Antonelli is doing the same thing to kind of prove a point that Albon's braking erratically, and this is what's required in order to, not run into the back of him. So I thought this was Mercedes at first playing some games. I'm not going to lie, though, like when I watched back Antonelli's onboard, it did look like he was going to hit the rear end of that Williams. So I think that might have been legitimate on Antonelli's. I question Russell's a lot more. I think that might have been, that was probably deliberate, but Antonelli's honestly might have been legitimate. I was very interested also because it happened after the drive-through penalty was also awarded to Russell, and Antonelli didn't look like he was going to give it back at first. And I was like, oh, that's a pretty dumb decision, but he ended up giving it back a little bit later. I think he was just waiting for a place where giving back the position wouldn't put him at risk from anyone else, and so I think that might have been what was happening there. But yeah, very, very interesting, and maybe Albon was actually braking pretty erratically, and that's what was causing those issues that Russell was reporting over the radio. But at the end of the day, it's hard to tell. It's hard to tell what's true, hard to tell what's games. I haven't seen the telemetry. If they release the telemetry, and the FIA and the teams definitely have access to the telemetry, you'd definitely be able to see what was going on. So I do hope that the FIA kind of reviews this, looks back at the data, and is able to determine whether drivers were doing erratic things throughout the race. And maybe that's a bit of the solution next year as well, is maybe not just the lap time delta, because like we said, that might not be enough. Maybe it's also kind of looking at the data and seeing if there's erratic behavior throughout the lap time that is being used strategically. Maybe there's some rules around that. I don't know. Other than making the cars smaller and lighter, again, I don't really know what's going to solve this race, but hopefully they're able to come up with something. Moving over more towards the end of the race, we had the funny exchange between Lewis Hamilton and his race engineer. It seems like it happens every race, but this one was honestly pretty frustrating in my opinion. Hamilton is asking if he's still a minute behind the pack, and then his race engineer comes over the radio and gives him a bunch of just totally irrelevant information, and then Hamilton's like, thanks, but like that's not what I asked. Am I still like a minute behind? And it's just it's unfortunately such a Ferrari just occurrence. I don't know what's going on with their pit wall. Like I said in previous episodes, it does seem like their strategy has been better this year, which is good. They're not making as many strategy errors. They're not making pit stop errors like they used to. Their pit stops have actually been pretty good. But the race engineer exchanges between both Hamilton and Leclerc have been a bit brutal, and it's tough to listen to those sometimes. And I can see why the drivers are getting so frustrated and annoying at these instances. And then closing it out with the end of the race, Max backing Lando up into Charles. It's hard for me to tell if Max was intentionally backing Lando up into Charles as a way for maybe Charles to overtake Lando, or if Max simply just did not have the pace because he was saying over the radio that his front lefts were pretty cooked, and he was on those tires for a while. He was trying to play the kind of red flag strategy to get to the top step of the podium. That was essentially his only shot. So once again, hard to tell if it was tires, hard to tell if it was strategic and trying to get, Charles to overtake Lando. But as soon as Max came in for his mandatory second pit stop at the end of the race, Lando really opened it up quick, and he opened up a big gap over Charles in only a lap. So I do think that might have been a bit of a risky and maybe dumb decision doing that. Like, he maybe didn't need to have that much pace and risk a crash on the last lap. But at least on the flip side, though, it did show that Lando did have the pace to win this race, and it wasn't just because he qualified P1 that he was going to win. It's hard to say had the race been raced like a normal race, like what would have happened. But it did show, at least on the last lap, that he wasn't lacking pace over Leclerc. He did have that pace in the car. So it was a pretty typical Monaco GP with maybe a couple little more exciting moments than the last couple years, but still a very much qualifying GP, still very much a letdown, still very much not what you'd want to see out of the pinnacle of motorsport. And so I hate to say it, but happy that we are past Monaco and can go back into some of our more traditional European circuits that allow for more overtaking and more, on-track battles. But that closes out my review of the 2025 Monaco GP. Stay tuned. If you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. I will be releasing a driver ratings coming up in the next couple days after this video drops. And we will also be doing our Monaco fashion review, which should be pretty interesting. I haven't really dug into it at all yet, but I would imagine that there was a lot of celebrities and a lot of drivers pulling up in some very Monaco-esque fits. The only one that I did see was Hamilton pulled up to the paddock on a superbike, which I thought was pretty cool. So we'll be diving and digging into that and doing our reviews. So stay tuned, and I'll see you all later this week.